both his upbringing and how he overcame difficulty. And here's a man who came from wealth, but who both his father and he cared deeply for the less fortunate. His father used to run basically what we would call a soup kitchen as an extra business, like not a business, but a charity. He did that on the side. And TR, overcame real physical loss. His mother had died the same day as his mom. So he had a lot of personal problems, but he was brilliant, really well-educated guy. And so this stuff here is, I consider his, from my own perspective, his less sort of beneficial or he was an imperialist, to put it bluntly. There's no way around it. You can't, and if you view imperialism the way I do as aggressive expansion over other countries and not necessarily consistent with democracy, then that's bad. And TR was that at times, but he is going to steadily evolve during his adulthood and during his presidency to not necessarily be an imperialist, but to be, I think, an American who evolves from his race, his jingoism, because he was white supremacist. They all were. Everybody at this time, and all these white leaders were believers in social Darwinism. It was easy for them to believe it. And so he is, for example, going to be the first president to host an African American in the White House. He has Booker T. Washington for a dinner. He has him over for dinner as president. That's the first time that ever happened. So there are going to be things he does, but he has to operate politically within the constraints of his time. So when I talk about admiring TR the most, it's usually when I'm talking about his presidency. This stuff here, I think, was sort of youthful. But keep in mind, I do believe at the core of what TR's value system is the idea that if countries, their citizens become fat and lazy, become decadent, then they collapse. That's the history of society, be it Spain or Britain, ancient Rome, when the people no longer have to struggle, no longer have to overcome difficulty. And that's one of the things I've said about this pandemic for young people. If you overcome this and survive and thrive in face of adversity, then that's extraordinary. That's something to be proud of. That's genuine achievement. And so TR believes that the martial nations, the nations that struggle, fight physically, and I know that today rings like warmongering, and it did then. There were people who criticized him as a warmonger. But TR also had a background before this. He had been the commissioner of the New York City Police Department, and he had done major reform for New York policing. And so he was really an up-and-comer in New York politics. You may remember there's a guy named Boss Platt. They called him the Easy Boss, and he had been the guy who recommended TR for Undersecretary of the Navy to try to get him out of New York, like get him out of dealing with New York bosses, so to speak. So when he resigned, he goes and he forms a unit. But I want to make sure you understand what this unit was like, the unit that's going to famously be represented in the Battle of San Juan Hill. And so first of all, I need you to know this guy on the left. So if you didn't write his name down, this is the actual commander of Roosevelt's regiment. So if you look on Roosevelt, and by the way, TR, in typical TR fashion, had a brand new suit created at Brooks Brothers, a uniform for him. So there's like a multiple $100 uniform. And he had Tiffany, the Tiffany company, like Breakfast at Tiffany's. The son of the Tiffany family was in the Rough Riders. And so he had Tiffany design their decorations, like the way the cavalry sabers look and all that. So, this is like a rich New Yorker getting dressed up to be a soldier, right? Well, he's never served in the military, like ever. And so normally you wouldn't quit being Undersecretary of the Navy and become a lieutenant colonel. Like, that's not how life works. You're not just automatically a lieutenant colonel. So he's like, I can't take command of the unit. And so he gets a friend from Washington, a person he knows who will later be a general. At the time, he was a colonel. And his name is Leonard Wood. So I think he's in the book. But make sure that when you're writing about the military leadership, so number 21 on the study guide, the military leadership of the Rough Riders was commanded by a full-bird colonel named Leonard Wood. And then under him, his adjutant, his next in command, was Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. And TR, is going to perform brilliantly in this. And this is one of the great things about it. So when you think about like Stephen Crane and the Red Badge of Courage, TR wants to be in a war. Keep in mind, this is now 33 years after the Civil War, right? So the entire Civil War generation is now old. They're like old people, okay? And so a full generation of Americans have never served in combat. And for TR, he believes that he'll never have an opportunity, all right? And so without having done that, how can you know, he considers, if you are genuinely brave? How can you know if you're genuinely strong, right? And so this picture here is utterly fanciful. This picture is utterly accurate since it was actually a photograph. So what happens is the command. So looking back at your notes, number 20 says, how was the U.S. unprepared for war? Well, first of all, where was the vast majority of the American military located? In the West, right, on the Great Plains, fighting the Sioux and stuff like that. So the Indians weren't even, I mean, excuse me, the army wasn't even back east, hardly at all. Secondly, though, there was very poor infrastructure connecting like camps and forts and things like that. Like, in other words, you really didn't have an interconnected system for the military. And then where did they launch the invasion of Cuba from? Does anybody know? I've been to the actual location, the port where they launched it. I'll give you a clue. There was a Super Bowl there this year. It's in Tampa, right? So in Tampa Bay, which, you know, is on the west side of Florida, right? So what they did was they took trains, and one of the stories about the Rough Riders is they had to abandon their horses so they could steal a train to ride to Tampa. So they left. Keep in mind, they're a cavalry unit. So what do cavalry units do? They ride horses. They're horse soldiers, right? So they go from being the Rough Riders to woods weary walkers, right? Like, so these are, in other words, these are cavalry. They're dismounted cavalry, is what we would call it in military terms. They're not actually on their horses. And that's to steal a train to get to Tampa in time to get on a boat to get to Cuba. So it's a completely, we would call in the military, logistical nightmare. There is no sort of central command of the military. There is no logistical supply chain. So the whole thing is completely, in just shambles. Plus, the military supplies are being bought from private salesmen who are ripping off the government. They're selling them rotten meat. They're selling them like rations that date back to the Civil War. So it's just terrible military preparation. But all that being said, the good news is we were fighting a really, really wimpy foe. All right. So here's Tampa, right? So the troop ships sail around here, and our Navy was better prepared for the Caribbean than the Spanish. And our warships sail between Haiti and Cuba. And here's where we're going to make landfall at, if you look over here, Daiquiri. And our commanding general, the general they get in charge is this huge guy, General Shafter. Let me see if I can dig up a picture of him. He was gout-ridden and was so obese they had to lift him up on his horse, and he got to the point where he was so heavy they had to carry him around on like a door. So I'm not a person who wants to fat shame anybody. That's not my style. Heck, I've been fat more than enough in my life. But this is Shafter, okay? And so Shafter was not going to actually be out there. Shafter is in the rear with the gear, if that makes sense. Okay, you guys know that kind of commander. So he's not going to be the frontline commander. But the Rough Riders, now the 1st Virginia Volunteer, 1st U.S. Volunteer, are going to dismount, and they're going to be marching here. And you can see their first engagement, and it's at this spot right here where TR shoots his first person, like kills his first person. He talks about shooting a Spaniard and watching him double over like a jackrabbit. So he gets. TR has to carry like 10 pairs of glasses because he's so nearsighted that if he doesn't have his glasses, he can't see anything. And they're fogging up. And he's constantly, like cleaning off the humidity from them and stuff, just like our masks. But I wanted to tell you the other commanding general over Leonard Wood, okay? And you might have read about him. I think he's in this book. Let me double check. But you had a general who was an old Confederate cavalryman. Anybody come across this name? No, he's not mentioned. Well, this is one of the major results of the war is going to have an outcome because of this fella. And I'm just drawing a blank on. I could see his face. Southern General Wheeler. His name is Wheeler. All I had to do was talk about it. Fighting Joe Wheeler. So let me show you Fighting Joe. This guy, and this is what he looked like in at the time of the invasion of Cuba. So this guy had been a Confederate commander. Okay, let me put him in here. And he's now going, and he was a congressman. He was a Democrat at this point. And I guess the 14th Amendment didn't quite qualify his level at the time. But he is going to say routinely when they attack the Cubans, get those damn Yankees. I mean, Spaniards, like when they're fighting, he like forgets. But Wheeler is an important, if anything else, symbolic guy. So here's Shafter. He didn't really run the show. In fact, Shafter got yellow fever while they were down there and pretty much had to like lay around the whole time. But Wheeler is going to go out in the battlefield, and it's his service over Theodore Roosevelt. Keep in mind, TR's mom was a Southern belle. She was a beautiful woman from the South. So this is the moment in American history where the North and the South come together. You understand? You've got former Confederates fighting on the same, wearing blue uniforms and fighting for the Union Army. They are launched from Florida, which was in the Confederacy, and they're celebrated as the American Army. You understand? So in many ways, one of these sort of certainly unintended consequences, but beautiful consequences of the Spanish-American War is that the North and the South start to kind of mend as a result of this war. And you have a renewed sense of enthusiasm for America as a country. But just to give you a sense of what happens, TR is marching along here with Wood, as well as an entire regiment of Buffalo soldiers. I don't want to leave them out. Do you remember Blackjack Pershing? He's there too with Wood at Kettle Hill, which is later going to be called San Juan Hill. As they come here in this area, I don't. Let me see if I can zoom in. Zoom in for you. As they come to right about here, you see where it says Marianaja, something like that. Up here is El Caney, but before they get here, there is an ambush. The Spanish have been planning to ambush this unit, which includes TR and the 1st Volunteer, as well as the Buffalo Soldiers. And what's interesting is Roosevelt's in the vanguard, which just means like in the front. And this is why you should always be open to learning anything. This is why my ears are always open no matter what it is. He is walking through the jungle of Cuba. And, as he's walking along, he's like, look at that orchid. And, he's pointing out all these different things. And then he stops. He's like, that's I forget the name of the bird. It's like a yellow-throated thrush, or something like that. And the soldiers are like, so? And he's like, that bird has no place in the Western Hemisphere. And it's a Spanish bird, right? And so TR kind of looks around and he's like, get down. So they get down and he recognizes that it's Spanish people, Spanish soldiers, making whistles to each other as like signals of bird sounds. But they're not birds that are indigenous to Cuba. And that's how good TR was at birds. All right, keep in mind, that's what he trained to be in college, was a naturalist before he went on to anything else. And so he actually recognized the bird call of the Spanish as not being the proper bird sound of Cuba. And they ambush the Spanish. They shoot them out of trees and they just blow them up, right? Then they get to this spot here. They fight a pretty pitched battle. And then they get to the final major battle of the war. Now, keep in mind, the entire land battle is going to last basically from June to July. Like the whole war is from June to July. That's why Hay calls it a splendid little war. But to take, this key location right here, Santiago, they have to take the hills that surround Santiago. And this is like an elevated ridge, really, over this river. And so they're all dismounted. But TR is one of the few people as a commander who still has a horse. And they're going to have to charge up an elevated hill, a steep hill, where on top are dug in Spanish guys with guns and artillery. And all the guys are like, all the Americans are kind of like hugging the ground, you know. And TR on his horse is like, get up, man, leave it, you know. And he's riding around straight out of a George Washington playbook. There are bullets whizzing by and stuff. Doesn't hit him. And so this is when TR becomes like an immortal figure. You know, he's going to pass into the pantheon of legendary status because he leads these guys up the hill and they succeed. You know, they take the hill, and this is a picture of them on that day. So TR is standing with his men. There he is, right there in the center, and they have just liberated San Juan Hill. Actually, the battle is this is like Bunker Hill kind of thing. The battle is actually on Kettle Hill, the major battle, but San Juan Hill is a later battle. So between these two battles, the Rough Riders become immortal. Now, to be fair, the African American soldiers should also have received that because they fight and take the hill too. It's like they're together. But you know, it's a black narrative. They're not going to talk about that in history books. So TR becomes one of the great. He becomes a household name in the United States, and really, he's probably the most successful figure out of the Spanish-American War, with the exception of maybe the Cubans. So we talked about he had already made this very sort of crafty decision to have Dewey on guard and launched the invasion of the Philippines. And tragically, we talked about the guy that helped us beat the Spanish is later going to lead the Filipinos against a war against our occupation. And this war is quite terrible. The couple hundred casualties of the Spanish-American War are nothing compared to the thousands of casualties of the Filipino War, the American War. And usually this doesn't get a whole lot of talk, but it happened. We try to solve the problem, McKinley does, by sending someone who is a decent guy over there to administer the Philippines. So he would be like a governor general, like a guy, he's not a general, but a governor who will help the Filipino people modernize. And this is one of the great debates about imperialism. So first of all, you should know that what Taft called, and this is future President Taft, and future Supreme Court Chief Justice Taft, what Taft believed was the way to do this was to show the Filipino people the sort of like good stuff of America. Look, let us do these nice things, and you guys will be sympathetic and supportive of us. And so you can see we provided roads, we helped create sanitation and public works, created a public school system. But I'm going to quote Gandhi here, because Gandhi would argue a similar argument as the Filipinos argued, and he said, there's not a people on earth that don't prefer their own bad government to the good government of an alien power. You understand? So no matter what good we did for the Filipinos, they did not view themselves as Americans. They didn't want to be Americans. They viewed us as trespassers. And so they wanted their independence. Ultimately, they're going to get their independence because of what the Anti-Imperialist League warned would happen. And I'll tell you that in a minute. So this doesn't really work per se, in a sense that the Filipinos, as soon as they can get independent, do. You understand? But Aguinaldo is going to get caught, and that'll end the rebellion. I call it rebellion, the independence movement, whatever you want to call it. So here you see this acquisition, and you kind of see the eagle is stretching its wing now all the way across the Pacific. So the agreement that ended the war, if you want to end a war, where do you go, right? Go to Paris. So this will be the third Treaty of Paris that we've now covered. The first Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War. The second Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution. And now this treaty. Of course, Woodrow Wilson will sign a treaty while negotiating in Paris called the Treaty of Versailles, right? So you get the idea that if you want to surrender, go to Paris. They're good at it. But nonetheless, Cuba will be free. Do we honor the Teller Amendment? You guys remember the Teller Amendment? Hopefully, maybe. The Teller Amendment said, what are we going to do in Cuba? When the war is won. When the war is over, Cuba gets its independence. And we did. We didn't take over Cuba. However, I should point out, if you don't know from reading, we did keep, well, that's in another, but I'll mention it. U.S. kept a permanent lease on Guantanamo. Guantanamo. I think that is going to be mentioned in the Platt Amendment. But I do want you to recognize that even to today, the United States, we have a possession in Cuba, a Marine base, which is where Guantanamo recently became famous again, or infamous, after 2002, when we started capturing enemy combatants in the War on Terror. And if you understand, if you're an enemy combatant and a soldier, you're under the guidelines of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which means you're a prisoner of war, POW. Right. If you're a terrorist, you're a criminal and have to be charged in criminal court in the United States. You have federal court for terrorists. So we were sort of in a conundrum here because these enemy combatants, we couldn't absolutely prove that they were terrorists. We captured them on the battlefield of Afghanistan, but they weren't representative of any army because Afghanistan wasn't the country we were fighting. You understand? So what do we do with these people? So American policymakers, particularly under the Bush administration, were concerned, like, oh, what do we do with these people? And they're like, well, if we put them in Cuba, they don't get the Constitution, right? And so that's what they did. They locked these guys up down in Cuba forever, theoretically, although later on a lot of them are going to get out. But that's because Cuba is not, the part of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, is not technically American, and so, but technically now it is. Supreme Court ruled that you can't do that. Like you can't circumvent the Constitution. You either have them as a POW or you have them as a criminal. You don't get to have them as nothing. Then you're taking away their liberty. So yeah, that's Guantanamo. Spain is going to surrender to us Puerto Rico, and we'll talk about the Forker Act in a second, as well as the island of Guam. So you start to see us picking up some small locations. I've been to Puerto Rico a couple times. I haven't been back since the last, terrible hurricane where they lost all the water and stuff like that. But here's Guam, which is a great stopover from Hawaii to Guam to the Philippines, right? You see it there? Of course, Puerto Rico's to the east of Cuba, right beside Jamaica, another cool place to visit. But the big thing, I always like them out of America. I should look for a book on this or something. When the war is over, we give the Spanish $20 million. So we're like a weird country in history that after we win, we give them money. And we did. And I don't know because we hadn't set out this war to take over the Philippines. That wasn't like the agenda of the American public, but that's what we ended up with. And we paid them for it. So that's kind of interesting, I think. Now, you might imagine, why would McKinley have trouble taking over the Philippines? What would be a reasonable reason? Nobody knows? Well, that's a very good answer. Christopher says it's going to cost a lot of resources, and we certainly do. We're going to spend the equivalent today of billions of dollars, it was millions then, in the Philippines trying to modernize it. But that's not really his big mystery. What do you think McKinley's problem is? Keep in mind, McKinley is a very smart politician, as much as Mark Hanna gets credit for all that. What's the real issue here? Well, yeah, he said the resistance of the people, guys that are listening. The problem is, for McKinley, he doesn't want to deviate too far away from what the American people want, right? And so while he is aware that there are a lot of reasons to take over the Philippines, it's also a lot of reasons not to take over the Philippines. So he really does antagonize this. Keep in mind, there's 7 million people, right? 7 million people who aren't Americans in Philippines, and not even remotely American. Like, they don't speak English at all. Their ethnicity is Asian. So, like, why are we taking this over? It's not going to be a state. So this is a kind of conundrum. But I told you yesterday, what's his ultimate reasoning for not, for taking it over? He doesn't want some other country to take it over. He feels like if we don't take it over, so to speak, then probably Japan will, or probably Germany will, or someone else will. Now, I want to talk about one other thing, though, that's really shameful about the American-Filipino War. You might recall that one of the reasons we went to war in Cuba was because of what the Spanish were doing to the Cubans, right? Well, I want to point out that during this war, America is going to engage in some really nasty behavior, and vice versa. Filipinos will too. But what countries do is a reflection of what countries believe. And so if we're comfortable or allowing for waterboarding and torture in concentration camps, then it's hard to lift yourself up as the bastion of liberty. You know, like you could say, yes, we're a tyrannical state that does bad things to foreigners, or you could say we're not that. So history's complicated, and really we're going to do some of the very things that we had criticized Spain for doing to try to suppress the Philippines people. So definitely be aware of that. Okay. Now, as a result of all this debate, you have perhaps one of the most eclectic and diverse and fascinating groups ever created. And it just strange bedfellows. So this is called the American Anti-Imperialist League. And they formed during the war as a vocal, outspoken, large group to say that it's not the role of the United States to be imperialist. In other words, we should not be an imperialist nation. And the question you might ask is why? Why shouldn't we be an imperialist? And so keep in mind, look at who's up here. You know, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, William James, the philosopher, and William Jennings Bryan, the populist. So you have all these different dudes who probably would never be in a room together for any other reason. And they were really much against this. So why? Do I have a list here? I do not. So I need to give you a list. So reasons. Well, let's see if you guys have done it. I'm looking at it, but I want to hear if you guys looked up the 4 reasons. Anybody do this?
I did.
It's violation of the consent of the governed.
All right. So it absolutely violates our sacred principles of self-government, right? Like, you know, America has always celebrated and held up the view that it was our sort of obligation to promote these values whenever we could. This is our justification for taking over places to teach them how to govern themselves, right? You know, so yes, absolutely. It was very inconsistent with the sort of American, certainly American beliefs that we held high. What else?
Despotism abroad will likely bring despotism at home.
All right, so that's a classic line. Do you know what that means?
Not really.
All right, yeah, so that's cool. And this was the same line that was used by your book when it was talking about radical Whig theory. So a despot is a tyrant, right? So if you're tyrannical to the Filipinos, it's kind of a slippery slope argument. You normalize tyranny at home. So the more we do bad stuff abroad, right? It's one of the reasons why I'm vehemently opposed to torture as American policy, because I don't care what small gains we might get from it. You know, the long-term gains is that we sacrifice the high ground, we sacrifice the moral ground, being the country that doesn't torture. And that actually has a great value in human interaction. What else?
Imperialism.
It's costly and probably.
All right, good. Go ahead, Nicholas.
It's costly and it probably will not make a profit.
So this is where guys like Andrew Carnegie get in. Its costs, economic costs, outweigh any benefits. So by that, we're not going to get much out of the Philippines. And you know what? Carnegie's right. They don't have a whole lot of resources and things that we need to make things better. Right? And it didn't. What else? And this is probably the one that makes the most sense when it comes to the future and why the Philippines gets its independence in 1946 with the Tiding-McDuffie Act.
Annexation would propel the U.S. into political and military cauldron of East Asia.
That's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
Guys, it's no coincidence that on December 7th, 1941, there was another place attacked besides Pearl Harbor. The Philippines, right? As soon as we take a foothold in the South Pacific, East Asia, really, then Japan will now view us as a threat. You know, and China is on the verge of collapsing, so they're not really in a position to give a hoot. But Japan is very much not happy about this. And I think McKinley was probably like, so the question I would ask you to do when you're considering this debate is which decision is the lesser of two bad decisions? Is McKinley right that if we leave it alone, the country will be taken over by Japanese? Will that be a problem for us? Keep in mind, what always should be our guiding principle with foreign policy? George Washington taught it. What should always be our guiding principle? Well, it doesn't have to be that. Any action you take must be in the interest of the United States. Like you should not and cannot put the interest of someone else above the interest of this country. I mean, this is national policy, right? So I wonder sometimes if McKinley was, thinking, well, gee, the Japanese will take over the Philippines and that'll be bad. Well, it probably would have been bad, but is that what you have to deal with sometimes? So the anti-imperialists were an interesting group of people, to say the least. Mark Twain, Carnegie, William James, Bryan, and they were very much opposed to this. Now, I don't know that number two is ever accurate for sure, because keep in mind, we're far more vigilant of our rights as Americans than we are vigilant of the Filipino people's rights, right? So I don't know for a fact that by us practicing, in fact, I know that what Taft did not become normal. I mean, people didn't start waterboarding Americans. Taft didn't waterboard, but the war. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I do think that it's hard to profess values of democracy and self-government while you don't allow 7 million people to practice it, right? That's like talking outside of your mouth. It's double talk. So good, excellent. So talking about the end of the war, I'll just get rid of this since we've already talked about Cuba. As far as the Teller Amendment, this is the easy boss. This is Boss Platt, and he was really one of the few guys who could push TR around a little bit, which he actually did some. But he is going to recognize that there is an opportunity in Cuba. So even though we've passed the Teller Amendment, keep in mind, the Teller Amendment was the amendment to the declaration of war. This is the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution. So very different when it comes to amendments. One is an amendment to the declaration of war. This is an amendment to their actual governing document. Now, by the way, this document is no longer active because of, guys like Fidel Castro, although Fidel was smart enough not to try to kick us out of Cuba, Guantanamo. So the Platt Amendment, named for Boss Platt, and Cuba, what you're seeing here is the sort of imperialist element of what we did in Cuba. Cuba is not allowed to make treaties or agreements with any other country that would in any way threaten their independence. So what that means is, keep in mind, this is sort of reminiscent of the Monroe Doctrine still. Like, no foreign country can in any way take over Cuba, culturally, ethnically, politically, or economically, right? We could intervene in Cuba. The U.S. could intervene if we weren't happy with what was going on down there. Now, we're going to learn about something called the Roosevelt corollary, but what you're reading here should sort of perk up and say, wait a minute, how do we have the right to intervene in another country's business? Yeah. So this is, over in Europe, they would call this type of behavior indirect imperialism, right? Sort of protectorate. Like, you can do stuff, but there's some things you can't do. Cuba, I mentioned Guantanamo. Today, it's the home of a Marine base and, housing of prisoners. And Cuba couldn't build up excessive debt. That's ironic. I wish we put that in our Constitution, right? So what they're telling Cuba is how to manage their affairs. You can be a country, but on our terms. Okay? So what about citizenship for these folks? Now, I'll come back to number 29 in a minute. It looks like your book takes the Philippines. I just did all the Philippines at once, but it looks like the book went a couple places. Let's take a look at Puerto Rico, okay? Puerto Rico, and that's number 26. So I jumped from the Platt Amendment up to Puerto Rico. Now, I love going to Puerto Rico, and I want you to understand this. Puerto Ricans are Americans. You people don't realize that, but it's unusual with They're people who live in two countries, basically. So under the law called the Foraker Act, initially, now keep in mind, they are today considered citizens. They weren't initially. So PR was an unincorporated territory. That meant not like the Northwest Ordinance Territory. So it was just a territory forever. And it still is. Today, Puerto Rico is still an unincorporated territory. That's kind of its status as far as our relationship with it. The citizens of Puerto Rico at the time, keep in mind that's at the time, not U.S., and Puerto Ricans would have tariff, like the tariffs that passed in America would affect Puerto Rico. Does that make sense? So in the beginning, Puerto Rico was not really much a part of America. So the question became, well, what about the people in Puerto Rico? Do they get these Bill of Rights? Do they get civil liberties guaranteed under the Constitution, protecting them? And the Supreme Court, and really I consider a sad decision, said that the Constitution does not expand to Puerto Rico. Congress could determine which individual rights Puerto Ricans had, not the Constitution, which I consider remarkable. But the reasoning is that because it was not considered part of the United States at that time, it was unincorporated. So it's really bizarre because it's a way of getting around. You do not need a passport. No, Jaden, I just saw your question. No, that's the great. You go to Puerto Rico, I can hop on a flight and have several times in January, particularly when it's freaking cold up here. With your driver's license, you can be in Puerto Rico in a couple of hours. You know, you fly from Greensboro to Florida, and then from Florida to Puerto Rico. Now they think they have direct flights from Raleigh. So, yeah, San Juan's, of course, the last couple of years we've had a really tough time down there with the hurricanes. But yeah, it's an easy place, and they take U.S. dollars, and a ton of people down there speak English. You know, everybody's about speaking both languages. So it's easy. It's like going to the Caribbean without having to get a passport on it, because it's in the Caribbean. It's like a full-blown Caribbean island. So anyway, things do change. So I'm going to go ahead and give you this now. It's not in this chapter. It's in, I think it's in the Woodrow Wilson chapter, because this is when it happens. But the subsequent law passed is the Jones Act. And today, Puerto Rico has full territorial status, no tariffs. They have a governor. They do not have electors, but they do send a commissioner to Congress, an observer. So they don't actually have a voting role. And this has been a debate that many congressmen, particularly Democratic congressmen, have actually supported Puerto Rican statehood. So Puerto Rico currently is divided within the country about 50-50. About 50% of the country supports statehood and voting for statehood. The other 50% like having sort of this semi-autonomous independence. Americans, when polled, usually oppose it. Puerto Rico would immediately become the poorest state in America, but that's not usually the reason people oppose it. The number one reason when asked on a survey is they think 51 stars is bad. You know, like it messes up the American flag. You know, they're just kind of like, oh, okay. But I guess if you were trying to get Puerto Rican statehood, you probably should tag team it with Washington, D.C. statehood. And then maybe you could get 52 stars. I don't know. But it's all messed up. Yeah, it's like we're so stuck on that number of 50 now that anything is going to be like not what people want, I think, overall. Well, yeah, we could do that. All right. Well, so let's finish up some questions. Time is it here? 2:30. Oh, okay. We got a little bit of time next. Let's go down here to the outcomes of the Spanish-American War. Okay. So let me enter another blank slide. And you guys have so far made my life much easier. Outcomes of the Spanish-American War. All right, so if you're making life super easy for me, let's ABC this thing. Who's A?
The United States becomes a respected world power.
Yeah. So while we beat up on a fairly wimpy European country, Spain, we still beat them up, you know, and we beat them up pretty like savagely, you know, if you think about like Dewey. So yeah, definitely good answer. U.S. gains global respect. All right. Anybody else read all the way up to 620? 621?
Exhilarating new martial spirit.
All right. So Do you understand what that means?
Isn't that like military power?
Yeah. So America becomes excited or thrilled or supportive of military. Okay. What that's probably a weird way of let's rephrase that. Huh. All right. So in other words, like we're much more militant after this. It's not like we were ever like anti-military, but it was more like, hey, let's get in a fight. Okay. So now that we won, we're all like happy about it. All right. What else? I might have this as a side one because I was thinking about a result of this is this is when, Alfred Thayer Mahan was president or was superintendent of the Naval College. And I think the War College started here too, right? The Army War College. And this is definitely vindication of Mahan and TR's big Navyism. That's a word. All right. I don't know. Is that what y'all had in there, or am I just making stuff up? Fair enough.
Yeah, yes, that's in the book.
Okay. I remember that as a key one, so I was like, I don't want to miss that. But all right. Who else has got something for me? Anybody working at home? Why does it do that? I don't want it to be that way anymore. Nobody?
I have another one.
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead. Christopher was talking. Well, while y'all are thinking about it, like a new spirit of nationalism. I'll try to get this fixed here. I don't know what I'm doing this for. There we go. All right, what else? Is that it?
Establishment as a fully fledged Eastern power.
Like East Asia, yeah. So U.S. now embroiled in Asian affairs. Did I make that 6? Yeah, it looks like I made that 6. Let me see if there's other. You got anything else in here? I think I meant 4 and 2 subsections. If that makes sense. Like this part down here, we were much more militaristic after this war. Not necessarily imperialistic, totally, but we're definitely more militaristic. All right, but I would say the biggest of all for me as a nation is this one. Okay, I would say the one in terms of long-term problems is this one. All right, because that's going to tie us into. Obviously, it's good to gain global respect, but in reality, we were in a position to not really have to worry about like the rest of the world. Still. All right, well, let's move into the rest of McKinley before he gets killed. So, yeah, these are good stuff, right? So let's get into 1900. And 1900 is just a redux of 1896, except one thing. Well, first of all, it's what 2 candidates? Well, it's McKinley versus Bryan. So the Dems nominate Bryan again. He's the most popular guy in the Democratic establishment, even though he's not really a Democratic establishment guy. His populism is still, doing its thing. But this time there is a new dynamic. Who notices the new dynamic?
The Democrats are campaigning against Republican imperialism.
All right. So the central issue for Dems is going to be anti-imperialism instead of gold. Keep in mind, gold has kind of failed, although I think Bryan briefly talks about that. But the Dems are strongly anti-imperialist. Okay? It's time. How do we know the Republicans aren't? Well, they definitely nominate McKinley, right? Their president. Gold standard, right? Down there, you can see it. Who's this guy? Yeah, Garrett Hobart is out. So you actually see a vice president out. I think he died, actually. That's why I wanted to check Garrett Hobart. Yeah, he died of heart disease at the age of 55. So while in office, he died, the young fellow. And so what that means is there's a vacancy for the vice presidency. So you remember that guy, Boss Platt, right? This guy has come out of, come back from the war and has become governor of New York. TR is now governor of New York, and he's very popular. And he's championing all this stuff, like civil service deeper reform and cleaning up the bosses, and he's doing all kinds of great progressive stuff. And they're like, we got to get rid of him. How do we get? And he's very popular. So this guy, Boss Platt, says, well, I got a good idea. Let's make him the most obscure office in America, vice president. So they kick him up from the governor's mansion to the vice presidency. And that, people are like, oh yeah, that's awesome. Like he's because he goes out and he out campaigns Brian. Now keep in mind, Brian is like a cyclone, right? Well, this guy does even more campaigning. TR is just nonsense, like a whirlwind. People used to say you had to wring the TR out of yourself after he was around you. He's just so much personality. But what they really run on, and I think this is going to be a consistent line for the rest of history, and you definitely should read this and know this. When William McKinley gets elected in 1900, the economy is booming. And he runs on a slogan, 4 more years of the full dinner pail. Now, in 1896, they ran a fairly close race, and the economy wasn't great. It's coming out of the Panic of 93, right? Well, now, full dinner pail means you didn't have to worry about where your food was coming from. And food insecurity is a terrible thing. So a dinner pail meant you're going to have plenty of food. It'd be prosperity. And so he runs on 4 more years, 4 years more of the full dinner pail. So prosperity at home, prestige abroad, pro-commerce. And man, the Republicans have gotten a whammy, and they just hand a victory to McKinley. I mean, this is an easy win. Brian Brian loses Nebraska, y'all. I mean, he's from Nebraska, right? So the South votes Democrat. Big shocker. The Confederacy always votes Democrat during this period. A couple of the border states. But, I mean, Brian even loses some key Western states. So McKinley wins comfortably in the election of 1900, right? And so that's pretty cool. Now, I would argue that this is not necessarily an open endorsement of all things McKinley. I do think this is still another example of like Brian scared off a lot of people. You know what I'm saying? But TR certainly didn't hurt. Now, before we get into the death of William McKinley, I do want to take you to one other location, and that's China. So McKinley's not dead yet, okay? He's been reelected. And so go back to China and remember that the Chinese had been the subject of hostile discrimination for quite some time, right? So they were used to, in America at least, being targeted for discrimination. But, such is life, right? But what happens is interesting to me is this. So this is where world history and U.S. policy intersect. If you know anything about, the Manchu, and they're depicted here in this way, it's kind of ugly, racist, totally ugly. But they had a 300-year-old dynasty that was collapsing. They had a 5-year-old emperor, 3-year-old at the time, I think, actually. His name was Little Puyi, and they had 50 years prior, or 40 years prior, the British had invaded with warships. It's called the Opium War. Britain had invaded China and with modern industrial steamships, and the Chinese had those like wooden barks, those old boats from the 1600s. And the British just obliterated the Chinese Navy, literally, just blew them out of the water and said, you will buy the stuff we have to sell that your people want. And that, of course, was opium. The Manchu dynasty did not want the Chinese people buying drugs, but the British went to war on China to force them to buy drugs from India. And so that forced them open. And so now many countries, you can see here, France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia, were all pouring into China. And the Chinese looked like it might get carved up, like Africa, like where they would end up taking over the places where people live. And they were establishing what were called spheres of influence, which meant they were going to have control and economic monopolies and stuff. And if you look at the map, America is not on it. All right, there's no America on this map. So, kind of out of the blue, William McKinley, Secretary of State, who was a great Secretary of State, really smart guy. John Hay had been personal secretary to Abraham Lincoln. So this guy has been around a while and knows his business. And he demands, he publishes like a letter to these countries. It's like a note. And he tells them they must respect China and its territorial rights. Like, in other words, they can't take over China. And China must be open to trade to any other country. And so what this is called is the open door policy. John Hay sort of slams open the door of trade in China. Now, and that becomes very, very popular. Keep in mind, Hay doesn't do this with China. He doesn't talk to China about it. He just insists on it. So here you can see where America has sort of flexed, because who cares what America says, right? So why would they agree to it? I think it has to do with the balance of power. In other words, I think these European countries don't want to push America into, say, the Brits' hands or some others. So China will not have its sovereignty taken from it. And that means, like, these territories will not be wholesale occupied by the Europeans. They'll have exclusive trade rights in some of these areas, but they will not be able to conquer China. And this lasts. Now, one last point about that. If he doesn't consult the government of China, and he doesn't seem to ask China or care about it, and all these Europeans are taking over, well, then that's going to produce a backlash. And you do have a terrible backlash. It's called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were a martial arts spiritualist group who believed that the souls of their ancestors, is very similar to the ghost dance, would create protective armor for them. Okay? And then they would attack. And so they started, I hate to be ugly, but kill whitey. Any white people in China, they started to kill. So missionaries and businessmen, and they were angry at the Chinese government, and they wanted to undermine, the presence of foreigners as well as Christian Chinese people. Anybody in China who was not sort of comporting with their old way. So you're going to have the first time in the history of the United States, or since the American Revolution, America is going to join with other countries in a military force. And you'll see a multinational force of soldiers, Russians, Germans, and Americans, to fight to put down the Boxer Rebellion. What you won't see putting down the Boxer Rebellion is the Chinese government. So what this should tell you is that China is really a crippled nation state, okay? And as a result of the Boxer Rebellion, they forced the Chinese government to pay them money. But what you're probably recognizing is if China is this weak, probably not going to be very long before someone tries to invade it outright. So when we get to World War II actually begins 10 years before World War II, with the Chinese being attacked by Japan. And no one in all of these countries will do anything to stop it. You understand? So you can see here, this is 1910, right? Or 1900 when the open door policy comes out. So 30 years later, China will be attacked by the Japanese, and the rest of the European countries can't stop it at that point. And so we'll talk about like the Depression and things like that leading to that. Okay? So we'll close today with the death of William McKinley. William McKinley was, an easy victory for the 1900 election. And the idea of promoting TR to vice president wasn't really William McKinley's. This was decided by the Republican bosses. Why did TR go along with it? Some people question that. And the answer is that TR wanted to be in Washington. He wanted to have a national place where he could remind people who he was. And he very much saw himself as the guy who would be coming after McKinley. All right. Now, he never envisioned this happening. McKinley was not old, so I think when he was assassinated, he was in his 60s. Let me double check. No, I don't want to tell you wrong. he wasn't like an old man. He was born. Yeah, he was 58. Yeah, 58 years old. So he wasn't old. So nobody really expected anything to happen to William McKinley, and so this is a great way to make TR vanish. So you remember that Columbian Exposition of 1893? Well, the year was 1901, and they were having another one of these expositions, these sort of world fairs. And this was in Buffalo. And President McKinley was invited to, like, start the ceremony, like to kick off the activity. And so he had a tent where he would greet the public would come and he would shake hands with them. And he had a Secret Service detail. Like, by this point, the president was guarded. And they stood around at the tent and they watched the lines of the people go. By then, people would handshake in lines all day. Like, TR had to set the record for handshakes he could do in 4 hours. He shook more hands. So McKinley's and by all accounts, McKinley's like a really nice guy, like a decent fella. He's just, high tariff guy. But so anyway, he's coming along, and this fella, and this guy is one of the more miserable people of history, Leon Czolgosz. So Leon Czolgosz was an immigrant, and he was an anarchist, but he was so uncool, the anarchists didn't want him. So when I call him an anarchist, he was not part of any anarchist group. Like, he actually tried to join anarchist groups, and they kicked him out. They didn't like him. He was annoying. He was ultimately obnoxious. But he thought the best way to disrupt the American political system was to assassinate the president. So this will be your third presidential assassination. And Czolgosz will carry, I think it's I forget what caliber gun it is. It's like a 25 or like an odd caliber gun. It's a small pistol. It's not a 38, I don't think. Yeah, I forget. Is that for sure? Yeah, it was not a big gun at all. He had it wrapped in bandages on his hand, his right hand. And, there it is. It's it was a 32. Okay. 32 caliber. And, I'll show you all what it looked like here since I took the time to look it up here. So he has it wrapped under like a bandage. And so McKinley, in good McKinley fashion, actually offers him his left hand. Like, he says, here, you can shake this. I'll shake your left hand since your right hand's in a bandage. And while he offered him his left hand, Czolgosz puts the gun at his stomach and shoots him. And the bullet lodges in his intestines, like deep. So they think, they think that maybe he's going to make it. Like, he has a chance to pull out of this, but he gets his condition turns worse. I think like the 5th day. Meanwhile, TR is busy climbing a mountain. Like, he's way up in the mountains, being TR. This kind of stuff he'd do for fun. And they have to send a runner up into the New York mountains, Adirondacks or Catskills or one of these mountains. And they're like, Mr. Vice President, you must come quickly. The president's been shot, And so they come down on a wagon and hop on a train. And by the time they get to Buffalo, the president's dead. The president's died from this wound. And so, in the words of Mark Hanna, this is his quote, "That damn cowboy's president." All right. So that's how the Washington establishment viewed Theodore Roosevelt as a damn cowboy. And now, so I'll be honest. TR is going to try for about a minute to respect McKinley, and it'd be like McKinley-ish, and then he's going to unleash. Because TR now wants to be president in his own right. He's president in 1901. Keep in mind, TR is interesting because he's president for a full 4-year term, right? Keep in mind, this is the summer of his first year, second term. So he's going to be all of those 4 years, and he's going to get reelected. And so TR is your first real serious potential third term. Okay. So anyway, I'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt tomorrow, and I'm going to stop recording. And if you have questions or things you want me to help find and see, I know some of you guys are learning, as you should learn, that